All right, we'll begin the lesson this week on the book of Judges. This is lesson number 7 for the fall semester of 2023. And we've been looking at the judges up to this point, and now we see Gideon. Gideon may be one of the more well-known of all the judges. Samson probably the best known of all the judges. But all of them had their importance in history and in the Bible and in the lives of Israel. I remember this period we're looking at in the book of Judges covers a 305-year period of time. And the judges did not serve one after the other. When it shows their captivity here, we're not talking about all 12 tribes going into captivity at one time. What we find here is that some of the tribes will go into captivity, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 at a time, but not all 12 at a time. And so that's why the book of Judges is a little bit difficult to see as far as the concerning of the time period. But if you go to 1 Kings 6, you can look at that reference there, talking about building the temple and when they came out of Egypt, and that gives you a good timeline up to when they built the Jewish temple, when Solomon had the temple built. And so the Bible here does tell us the events going on with Gideon and the army that he had. And you remember with Gideon, God made it very much aware that if you trust in God, you don't need a massive army. Deuteronomy 17, I believe verse 17, talks about the laws concerning the kings of Israel. And in that passage it says there's 3 things that the king of Israel should never do. One was to multiply wealth. We know Solomon, that's what he did. The other was not to multiply wives. And yes, with Solomon, we know that he very much so did that. And the other was not to multiply horses. And Solomon actually did that as well. They said in one place there at Megiddo that Solomon had up to 40,000 stalls for horses. And that's just one part of Israel. Imagine what's all throughout the land. And why did God not want them to have those things? Well, if you seek after wealth, that's what you trust in, and that's what happened to Solomon. You seek after wives, and God said that they'll turn your heart away from him, and that's exactly what happened to Solomon. And then the multiply horses is because horses were used for the military, for a defense. They were offense. They were not used for recreational purposes like we do today. And so the only reason you had horses was that it was for your army. And God said don't multiply horses because God says you don't have to trust your army. Yes, should you have an army? Yes. Should you prepare yourself to defend yourself? Absolutely. However, when it comes time, God is in control. And God expects us to use the common sense that he gives us to have a certain amount of defense. But when it comes down to it, to understand that only through God can we really truly have a success. And so Gideon here was told by God, Judges 7, 1 and 2. I remember his prior name was Jerubbaal, one who contends with Baal. And he did that, remember, at the breaking down the statue or the image, altar of Baal that his father had set up. And so it says Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands. Lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand has saved me. And that right there, that's a great key to what we're studying here in verse 2. God says, if I let you prepare all the people for war, and if you win, then who are you going to give glory to? Well, your own selves. And so God here says, people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites in their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves up against me, or with pride. They go and say, well, my own hand has saved me. That's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Remember Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the tree, and God had him, the tree cut down. And the moral of the story was that Nebuchadnezzar controlled the world at that time for the most part. And God said, because you're pride, I can cut the tree down. Well, one day he went out on his land there, and he looked at his kingdom. He said, this is a kingdom that I have built with my hands, that I have done. And so God here humbled him by sending him 7 years into the wilderness. But there's that pride. I did this. A couple times there at Shechem, when God had them build the altar, he said, don't use man-made tools upon the altar. Showing that God himself is enough. He doesn't need us to build any altars for him. He created the world. He can do whatever he pleases. And so there's the problem that God is saying, that if I let you build up an army, then you're going to take credit for it. And so that's what God here illustrates to them. He has his army drop from 32,000 down to 10,000. And then from 10,000 down to 300. Approximately 97% reduction in the army. By man's view of this, it would be impossible for Israel to defeat the Midianites at this point. But that's God's in control, and that's the great story here, the great lesson. It says, now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned to the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many, bring them down into the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So he brought down the people into the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, everyone that laps of the water with his tongue, or sticks his face already down into the water, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, everyone that bows down upon his knees to drink, and the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, so they dip their hand in water, bring it up to the mouth, were 300 men. But all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. Now, people try to make a lot out of this as to what happened, and they try to say, well, because 300 men, you can tell are warriors because they put their hand in the water and brought it to the mouth to where they could still see and look around them. Whereas the other ones, when they dipped their whole face down to the water, they could not see anybody sneak up on them. Now, granted, that would be a good characteristic for someone if they're going to battle. But remember, God is not saying that this was done by man. He's not saying these 300 warriors here are going to be so great that they can defeat all the enemy. God is saying that I can knock your numbers down until you recognize the fact that God and God alone gives the victory. So I don't make much of this. I know some people do, and that's fine. I don't see it there because I think it takes away from what God, the whole lesson that God is trying to teach here, is that he is enough. If the numbers had come down to just Gideon by himself, Gideon would be enough. God would give him the ability to defeat the enemy, and he would come back victorious, just like he did with his 300 men against the enemy. So Gideon here is assured of victory. He's still outnumbered 450 to 1. So multiply 300 times 450, you see the size of the Midianite army. And it's important that we talk about Midian. It says, the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand. And let all the other people go, every man unto his place. Now, the Midianites were not Canaanites. They're a different group altogether. The Midianites are descendants of Abraham. Abraham was his second wife, Keturah, and I think it was his fourth son was Midian. And if you remember earlier, we talked about Midian with Moses. When Moses came out of Egypt, when he fled Egypt at 80 years old, he fled to Midian. And there at Midian, he met a priest, Jethro. And the Bible refers to him as Jethro, the priest of Midian. So Jethro was, in a sense, related to Moses. distant ancestors, but nevertheless related to Moses, because both of them came from Abraham. Now, the big difference is the promise that was given to Abraham's descendants through Isaac, because he's the only one that received the promise. The Abrahamic covenant was passed from Isaac down to Jacob, and Jacob became the father of Israel as a nation. And so you have the promise there of I will bless him at blessing, curse him at cursing. The Midianites did not receive the promise, nor did the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael receive the promise. So the Arab people did not receive that promise. Only Israel, the Jewish people, received the promise that I will bless him at blessing and curse him at cursing. And so the Midianites did have the truth. When Moses fled Egypt and he came to Midian, there he took Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, to be his wife. And he had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar, who on their way to Egypt in Exodus chapter 4, God rebuked Moses at that time and told him that he was going to kill him. And the reason was because Moses did not fulfill God's will at that time. And God's will was to have his two sons circumcised. Well, there on it says in Exodus chapter 4 that Zipporah got so upset with Moses over this and did not want it to happen. And finally, she did it herself and basically separated from Moses at that point. Moses sent her back to Midian, to her father's house, Jethro. Now, after the Exodus, they came out. Eventually, in Exodus chapter 18, we see that Zipporah reunites with Moses. And the sons would came back at that point. And after that, we don't know anything about his two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. In fact, in Numbers chapter 3, I believe it is, it gives the genealogy or the descendants of Moses and Aaron. And if you read down through that chapter, you'll find that Moses' descendants are never mentioned. If you remember, Moses' wife Zipporah died along the journey, and he ended up in Numbers chapter 12, I believe it is. I think it's Numbers 12. He married an Ethiopian woman, and of course that upset Aaron, and it upset what's his sister's name? I just had a lapse in memory right here. But it upset his brother and sister. I'll leave it at that. I'll think of it here in a second. And so they were upset because Moses married an Ethiopian. He married a black woman. And when they went against Moses, God gave Miriam, there's his sister's name, there it is. He gave Miriam leprosy for 7 days. And the people had to wait, knowing exactly what took place, and that they had rebelled against Moses at that point. And so at that point, now he has another wife. At the end of the journey, we don't know what happened. After Moses died, we don't know what happened to his second wife, and we don't know what happened to the children. They're never mentioned again. But the point goes back to that the Midianites did have the gospel. They had the truth. They were descendants of Abraham, therefore they would have known what God had said in times past. They didn't have the scriptures, but nobody did at that point. But they did have the truth of God. And so Jethro later, if you remember, would join Moses and even counsel Moses when Moses had to sit and judge the people all day long. Jethro came to him and said, "This is ridiculous. You need to appoint men to help you judge." And God confirmed that to Moses, and so he chose 70 men to help him judge the people. They would deal with the small matters, he would deal with the major matters, I suppose, what would take place. But now the Midianites, and when talking relatives of Moses here, very possibly, could have been part of the Midianites at this point. But just because the Midianites had the truth at one point, we see that apparently now they have rejected it, and they're going against God's people. And God, again, refer back to the Abrahamic covenant, I will bless him that bless thee and curse him that curse thee. And they should have known that they were not God's seed as far as the blessings are concerned. Then Judges 8:10 says, Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their host was with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of all the host of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew sword. So Gideon here absolutely assured of victory. Before the battle, Gideon receives reassurance that he would be victorious. It says, So the people took victuals in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, Arise, get thee down into the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Phurah thy servant down to the host, and thou shalt hear what they say. And afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down into the host. Then went he down with Phurah his servant, and to the outside of the armed men that were in the host. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. And their camels were without number, as the sand by the seaside for the multitude. So Gideon goes down, sees all the enemy there, which I'm sure was overwhelming. Verse 13, when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow. So Gideon is overhearing this conversation by two enemy soldiers. And it said, I had a dream about the battle. He said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came into a tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it that the tent lay along. So here's some bread that knocked down one of our tents there. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. So here Gideon overhears this conversation and gets some reassurance that God says, I told you I'd give you the victory, and here's an example of what's going to take place. The battle was ready. Everything's at this point. Gideon does prepare his soldiers, 300 men, tells them to take a torch, put it inside of a jar, so as they get near to the camp, nobody can see your light, the flame. They didn't have flashlights. They didn't have torches like we think of today where they can just turn them on and off. They had to have this fire already, and so they didn't have matches, what have you. And so the best way to do this was to allow the torch to burn with inside a jar so that there would be enough oxygen there to keep it burning, but yet it would shield the fire from the enemy. And when they get close, they would shout the sword of the Lord in Gideon, and at this point then the Midianites would flee. Judges 7:22, 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah in Zeriath, and to the border of Abel-Maholah, unto Tabbath. And he divided 300 men into 3 companies, put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers, and lamps within the pitchers. And he said to them, Look on me, and do likewise, and behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, shall ye do. When I blow a trumpet, I and they that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of the camp, and say, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon and 300 men that were with him came to the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, and they had but newly set the watch. And they blew the trumpets, brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and they held the lamps in their left hands, and the trumpets in the right hand to blow withal. And they cried, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So not every man's going to have a sword in his hand. When you have a pitcher in one hand, you have the trumpet in the other. Again, this shows the power of God. It wasn't the power of the 300 men and Gideon, but it was the power of God. 120,000 people slain. 300 go in, kill 120,000 people. That's at 4,000 per Midianite. So 4 Midianite leaders end up being captured and killed, and God gave them peace in the land. For 40 years gave them peace. Later on, the victory referred to in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, the faith chapter. But we see here, it says, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Cachor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of the host of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew sword. And they took the 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb, and they slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb, and Zeb they slew at the winepress of Zeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them, and took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discovered all the hosts. So there you have the 4 Midianites, Zebah and Zalmunna, and just to back up here and see the other 2 names, Oreb and Zeb. So Oreb, Zeb, Zebah, and Zalmunna were killed. The leaders were killed off. Then Zeb and Zalmunna said, Rise thou and fall upon us, for as a man is, so is his strength. And Gideon rose and slew Zeb and Zalmunna, and took away the ornaments that were on the camel's neck. So they didn't want their lives spared. They said, if we don't have strength, then we're not men. So the best thing to do is go ahead and kill us. And that's exactly what Gideon would do here. Thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lift up their heads no more. And the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. So, again, these battles in the land of Canaan wasn't just against the Canaanites, but all inhabitants of the land. And the Midianites were not supposed to be there in the first place, just like actually the Canaanites were not supposed to be there in the first place. That land belonged to Israel, and will always belong to Israel no matter what happens politically in the world today. 70 A.D., Jewish people were kicked out of the land. 1948, they were then again recognized as a nation. But the time period from 70 A.D. to 1948, Israelites have always dwelt in the land of Israel. Yes, other people moved in on them, but the fact is there have always been Jewish people in the land. Not been a time in history that they did not have the Jewish people there. The only thing was they were controlled by the Gentiles, which is really true even today. While Israel is a separate nation from everybody else, without the help of the United Nations, United States, Britain, other countries, Australia helping Israel to be a nation, they would not survive. And that's what God said, that the times of the Gentiles, that Israel would suffer until the times of the Gentiles ended, and that will end at the second coming of Jesus, when he takes over control of the land and the Gentiles have nothing more to do with it at that point. After the battle, the Ephraimites, upset for not being in battle, they wanted to have their part in it, and they didn't get a chance to. Sukkoth was punished for refusal to send troops, or to feed the troops rather. And then Gideon's brothers were killed by the Midianites in this as well. So they did suffer some loss, and then you have jealousy. Why couldn't we go to battle? And you think that if they really wanted to be in the battle, they would have volunteered and been there anyway. But it's always easy to complain after the fact that, oh, well, if I was only there, I would have received the victory. And again, Sukkoth failure to feed the troops, that was a big deal. And the men of Ephraim said to him, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not, when I went to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply. And he said to them, What have I done now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than vintage of Abizar? God hath delivered into your hands the prince of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison of you? Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that. So Gideon here rebukes them. Here they're upset. Why, if you just called us, we'd come and help. And Gideon responds and said, what have I done to you in comparison of you? I mean, you're better off, aren't you? The Midianites have been subdued. Who's going to benefit from that? And then they got to thinking, well, I guess we are. Exactly. So why are you complaining? And so they did. Their anger was abated. And Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and 300 men that were with him, faint, yet pursuing them. I mean, these still are men, human beings, that are in battle, and they will be thirsty and they will be hungry just like anybody else. In the life that we live today, we have need of food. Yes, God can take care of everything, and God can make us live from now on without food, but he has chosen at this time for us to have a reliance upon food and water. And so, verse 5, he said to the men of Sukkoth, give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto the people that follow me, for they be faint. And I am pursuing after Zeba and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the prince of Sukkoth said, are the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thine army? And Gideon said, therefore, when the Lord hath delivered Zeba and Zalmunna in my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And he went up thence to Penuel, and spake unto them likewise. And the men of Penuel answered him, as the men of Sukkoth had answered him. So here's the audacity of the men of Sukkoth, who, again, they would benefit, as he reminds them, that when I subdue the kings, and so they said, well, we'll give you food after you subdue the kings. Well, they need food to go into battle. And so Gideon has very, very harsh words for them when he says, in my hand, I'll tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness with briars. And Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle before the sun was up, and caught a young man of the men of Sukkoth, and inquired of him, and describing him the princes of Sukkoth, and the elder thereof, even 70 men, so 77 men. And he came unto the men of Sukkoth, and said, behold, Zeba and Zalmunna, with whom you did upbraid me, saying, are the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thy men that are weary? And he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkoth, and he beat down the tower of Penuel, and slew the men of the city. So after defeating the enemy, comes back and says, listen, here, okay, you said you wouldn't give me anything until I had the enemy in hand. Well, here they are. Now it's too late. So he beats him, tore down the tower of Penuel, and slew the men of the city. In chapter 8, Gideon's brothers here, then he said unto Zeba and Zalmunna, what manner of men were they whom ye slew at Tabor? Well, they answered, as thou art, I mean, just like you are, so were they. And each one resembled the children of a king. And he said, they were my brethren, even the sons of my mother. As the Lord liveth, if you had saved them alive, I wouldn't slay you. And he sent Jethro his firstborn up and slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared, because he was yet a youth. So not all Gideon's brothers were killed, but they killed so many of them. And he said, if you'd save their lives, I'd save your lives. They then asked Gideon to rule over them. They wanted to make him their king, their ruler. So Gideon refused to reign over him, but he did request a golden ephod. So Gideon made an ephod thereof and put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon to his house. And Gideon was not a priest. The ephod was for the priest. And what he did here is, the apostasy falling away here, is that even though God did protect him for 40 years from going back into captivity, here's where Gideon messed up. Same thing happened in Moses' day, after Moses' day. It wasn't Moses' fault by any means. When Moses was told to make a bronze serpent upon a pole, and all the people had to do was look upon it, and they would be healed of them being bit by snakes in the wilderness. And later on, in the days of Hezekiah, it says that Hezekiah destroyed the image. They called it Nehushtan, 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 which is another word for bronze. And so they started worshiping that image. And so Hezekiah had sense enough to destroy the image. And here's what happened. They made an image and they started worshiping that image. We see that today. People sometimes with their crosses. And I'm not opposed to using the cross as a symbol of the church. Nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But it is not something to be worshipped. The Catholic Church leaves Jesus on the cross. I do have a problem with that. I don't think that that's the crucifix is what they call them. I don't think that's right because Jesus is not on the cross anymore. He rose from the dead. And I think that's a very important thing to teach. But what people do is try to make something of that cross. Historically, although obviously not true, the cross was something that could get rid of vampires. And so they made something more of the cross than what it truly is. It's a symbol of Jesus' death, but all it is a symbol. I remember stopping at a store one time years ago, and they had little crosses on the counter of it. It was actually a restaurant, not a store, but a restaurant up in Mount Airy. And they had these little knickknacks on the checkout counter, and one of them had crosses in it and had a little poem or something with the cross, and there's no way I can remember what it said, exact word for word, but basically what it said was if you take this cross with you and you keep it in your pocket, and when trouble comes, you just hold on to the cross and rub it with your fingers, then your day will go better. And now I know it's not the exact statement that was made, but it's that belief that there's something magical about the cross itself. The original church did not have the cross as a symbol. It did not come until years later, and probably because of Roman Catholicism, that crept into even biblical Christianity. The early symbol of the church was a fish, because the Greek word for fish is ichthus, and if you take individual state letters out of the I is first letter of Jesus in Greek. The CH is the first letters of Christ in the Greek. Then a TH is first letters for God, theos in the Greek. And then the U is the first letter of the word son, weos in the Greek. And then the last letter S, ichthus. Last letter S is for Savior. And if you put all that together, it's Jesus Christ, God's Son and Savior. And so they used that as a symbol for the early church. And sometimes you can find an anchor was used for the symbols. And those went away because God did not ordain them. The cross itself, like I say, it's important to me because what it represents, but it's not a good luck charm. God is the only one thing that we need. All right. We'll continue with this next week.